Good morning. Welcome to our event, Central America, Integration, Investment and Trade Opportunities.
Thank you, President Mossi. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all to the presentation of this report that UNFIV has published together with the Central American Bank for Economic Integration. To start with, I'll go through the findings of the report, and then we'll have a panel discussion to discuss the opportunities and trade and investment outlook for the region. So if we can move to the next slide to go through the presentation. So the report looks at 8 countries. So in Central America, we look at Belize, Costa Rica, Dominican Republic, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, and Panama. And we look at 5 pillars that we believe make up the important economic and investment themes in the region. So we have the macroeconomic overview. What is the macroeconomic backdrop to the region? That's a very important draw for foreign investment as well, for the economic development outlook of the region. We look at commerce, external trade, and FDI, foreign direct investment. How are the links that are being built? What is the investment appetite for flows into the region? We look at the integration process. So how are countries in the region integrating with each other, but also what are the ways that they are connecting with other parts of the world? We look at the finance, tax, and transparency environment, so the infrastructure supporting financial markets development and investment. And we also have a 5th pillar that is looking specifically at sustainable investment, which is something that a lot of countries, not just in the region, are now looking to how to build back better, support their recoveries in a sustainable way, and move towards more resilient ways of economic development. So if we move to the next slide, starting with the first pillar, which is looking at the macroeconomic overview. So what we look at in this pillar is macroeconomic indicators, your typical bread and butter, GDP growth, GDP per capita, what are the living standards, how fast has the region been growing, what has been the impact of COVID-19 on the economy, inflation, public debts, etc. And if we move to the next slide, we can see some of these indicators in more detail. So for example, looking at the GDP growth, if we move to the next slide, here you can see both the historic performance in terms of the economic development, economic growth of the region compared to other blocks in Latin America, as well as the forecast. And what's really interesting here is that the region has been growing quite steadily, quite fast. So average growth rate above 4% for the past 5 years. This is quite remarkable when you consider global GDP growth has been quite weak, and also when you look at the rebound and the recession that a lot of countries, a lot of blocks are facing in 2020s. In 2020, it's milder in Central America compared to other blocks in the region, indeed compared to the world economy as well, which is the purple line there. And the rebound is also stronger at 6.8%. It's quite a strong rebound that the IMF is forecasting for 2021. So of course, these forecasts can be revised, but I think the important takeaway from this slide is the difference with other blocks. And if there is a prolonged crisis in terms of the COVID pandemic, that will affect everyone. What is important to see here is that the fundamentals have been strong in the region in preparing it to have the policy space to respond to the pandemic. If we move to the next slide, that is showing by country the historic performance as well as the forecast. And you can see what's really interesting is that the 2021 forecast for most of the countries, for 5 out of the 8 countries, is positive for, and that's notwithstanding the recessions that we may see in 2020. So it's just 3 countries that are seeing negative growth in 2020, 2021, and growth in the previous 5 years has been quite strong for a lot of the countries that we are looking at in this report. If we move to the next slide, in terms of GDP per capita, you can see that it's a region that has uneven levels of development compared to other economic blocks. I mean, even in the Euro area, we have very big differences in terms of GDP per capita when you compare, for example, Germany with Portugal, or when you compare also within the United States, the GDP per capita between, say, Massachusetts and Mississippi is also quite big. But as we see more integration in regions, you tend to expect to see that convergence more. And when you look at GDP per capita levels, you have countries like Panama or Costa Rica that have quite high GDP per capita levels, so above the global average, which is around $11,500. And then you have some other countries that are much lower. So for example, in the case of Nicaragua or Honduras, it's even below $3,000. So there could be quite a gap between the regions. You can see that here now that we have the slides again. If we move to the next slide, that is showing the response from the COVID-19 crisis. So a lot of governments around the world and central banks have taken extraordinary measures to support their economies. And here, perhaps this is a bit too detailed for the presentation, but I encourage you all to download the report and see that in more detail. We have assembled all the measures that different countries have taken to support their economy. So on this slide, you see the fiscal measures, things such as spending more public investment, more tax payment deferrals, etc., salary compensations for workers, and so on. So quite a lot of countries in the region have taken such measures, some more than others. And then the next slide also looks at some of the monetary measures that central banks have taken in terms of, and also more related to financial markets. If we move to the next slide, in terms of monetary policy rate reductions, reductions of reserve requirements, liquidity measures, and so on. So it's really a cocktail of measures that central banks, fiscal authorities, supervisory authorities have taken in the region. And that's very much in line with what we're seeing in the rest of the world. But what is outstanding in this region is that they've had the policy space to go really all in with a lot of these measures to bring out the big bazookas in terms of fiscal policy, of monetary policy. Not every country globally has had this policy space because they have faced more challenging economic times before the crisis. If we move to the next slide and start introducing pillar 2, that is looking at the commerce, external trade, and foreign direct investment. We're looking here at what are the major trading partners, what are the existing free trade agreements for the region. And so if we move to the next slide, that is showing some of the top sectors for the different countries. Again, quite a bit of detail here. That is a lot of information in the report. You can see that by country in the report, we've seen which are the sectors that are most prominent in the economy, that are contributing most to GDP, and we're able, through this exercise, to draw some more general conclusions about what the region's economic advantages, focus is. So a lot of the countries focus a lot on agriculture, mining, manufacturing, and construction industries. Overall, there are some exceptions. So Costa Rica, for example, we've highlighted as an outlier, more focused on medical devices and equipment industry, as well as manufacturing again and tourism. If we move to the next slide, that is showing the foreign direct investment by different partners. So majority of FDI is coming from the US, as one would expect. 48% of FDI into the region, so it's a big trading partner for the region. Europe increasingly also, a lot of it is intra-regional as well, so the rest of the Latin America and the Caribbean region, 37%. Europe has grown quite a lot as well, 13% of foreign direct investment is coming from Europe, and we'll see also in later pillars how that has manifested itself also through development assistance and also trade agreements. And just 2% is from others, such as Asia, for example. But we do expect that to change in the future. We will also have a discussion in the panel with a colleague from Korea in terms of the links that are being built there. But you can see there is a lot of room, a lot of potential to increase that slice. It's just 2% in terms of FDI from outside of the US, Europe, and the region. And you can see also on the right-hand side of this slide, the FDI by recipient countries. So Panama, Dominican Republic really standing out there. In the case of Panama, is almost 5 billion. In the case of Honduras, is 500 million. So quite a big difference there. Again, that disparities that we've seen elsewhere. If we move to the next slide, that's also showing the trend of the value of total exports. It's again, it's something that changes gradually. It's not a very it's steep growth since 2016, but overall, it's in the environment where trade has been slowing compared to GDP growth. It's something that again stands out in the region. If we move to the next slide, that is showing also the export growth rate in the bloc compared to other blocks. So what you can see here is Q1 2020 versus Q1 2019. It was the only region or the only part of Latin America, Central America, that saw positive growth in exports, and that's also quite encouraging. When you look at a lot of regions, a lot of countries have been challenged by COVID-19, halt in production, halt in exports. Central America, positive numbers, 9.1 was the average. So that's quite a difference compared to the other countries. You see here some of the biggest economies in the region: Brazil, Argentina, Peru, Colombia, all having negative negative rates in terms of export performance. Moving on to the next slide and the third pillar. So the third pillar is looking at integration. So what we've done here in the report is looking at what has been the integration project. We'll hear a lot about this from President Mossi in terms of how CABE has supported and contributed to this process. But if we move to the next slide, we can see the types of areas that integration covers. So it's not just about economic integration, trade agreements, investment agreements. It also is really spanning more areas, and that's kind of closer to the model we're seeing in the European Union as well, where there's a lot of cooperation on climate change, cooperation on security, discussions about a European army even. So integration, once it starts, even if it starts as an economic project, a monetary project, it tends to move and expand beyond that. So here we see in the Central American integration project, issues such as climate change, institutional integration, security, social issues. It's extending beyond just the economy, which is what the report is focusing on, more on the economy, but there is a lot of other facets to it. And if we move on to see what have been some of the free trade agreements that the bloc has built, and building free trade agreements is something that is quite in fashion here in London, where I'm speaking from today. And we know very well here in the UK how difficult that can be. They can take months, years to negotiate and finally to achieve. So the fact that this regional bloc has achieved so many free trade agreements with so many different countries, and you can see here also Korea, Taiwan are two of these that we haven't really seen the results of that in terms of foreign direct investment, perhaps more on the trade side. But there have been free trade agreements also with the European Union, with Mexico, Chile, the US as well. So quite a lot of energy is going into these, as we know, but there is process to expand these to even more regions. If we move to the next slide, where we're looking at the direct cooperation and development projects, I referenced that a little earlier in terms of the EU really having the lion's share there, over 50%. Spain also very big player. Then the region itself around 9%, and then you move to kind of other countries. So Taiwan also having quite a high share there in terms of direct cooperation in development projects. And there is more information in the report in terms of what type of projects that covers. And if we move to the next slide, that's also focusing more on the free movement of people. That's again something that is an element of integration. It's not just about the free movement of goods. It's not just about the free movement of capital, of funds. It's also about how easy is it for people to move and work and travel across borders, making it easier for people to feel that they are part of a region, that they can work anywhere, they can visit, they can get to understand the cultures and so on. So there is an agreement also for a unified visa to allow free movement of people across the borders of Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, and Nicaragua. This is also important for foreign visitors, that they can just see the region as a unified bloc. If we move to the next slide and Pillar 4, which is looking at finance, tax, and transparency. Here, what we've done in the report is see an overview of financial systems in Central America. So what is the monetary policy regime? What is the exchange rate regime? How are banking sectors doing? Are they in line with global standards? How vulnerable are they? Is there enough information for foreign investors to look at the financial services industry in the country? How transparent is that? Are there credit ratings? If they choose to invest in the region, what are the rules around protection of minority shareholders? These are a lot of the things that we're looking at in Pillar 4. If we move on to the next slide, this shows the level of implementation of the Basel rules. So these are the international standards for banking supervision in the next slide. And what we've done in this pillar is look at which level of Basel, which stage of Basel are they at in terms of implementing. Basel III are the most recent ones. They're now talking about Basel IV. And you can see not every country in the bloc is there yet. So Guatemala, for example, is still at Basel I. El Salvador, Dominican Republic, Nicaragua are in Basel II. That means they have started implementing some elements of Basel II, perhaps not even all of them. So there is still some work to be done there in terms of getting into line with global banking standards. And if we move on to still Pillar 4, looking at the regulatory capital to risk-weighted assets. Again, The interesting thing here is all countries are above the Basel III minimum requirement of 10.5%, so quite a strong position there in terms of the security of the banking system. And even though we're entering a recession, not all of the countries in the region, but the world economy as a whole, this is quite a strong position to be entering the recession into. I was in a panel just now with governors from non-euro area European central banks, and a lot of them were talking about this weakness in the banking sectors and how important it is. So it's definitely a good position to be in. If we move to the next slide, still on pillar 4, we're also looking at the liquid assets to total assets ratio. Again, another indicator of strength and confidence to unexpected changes in cash flows. Having that share at a relatively high level, this is from Q4 2019, so just before the crisis hit, is very important. And then the final slide for pillar 4, if we move on, is looking at the credit ratings, both in terms of sovereign bonds and corporate bonds. So in terms of sovereign bonds, all 3 major ratings agencies rate sovereign debt for 6 countries in the region. And then in terms of corporates, we're seeing that economies that have a higher concentration of financial institutions tend to have quite a lot of corporate ratings. So for example, in the case of Panama, that is 79 ratings in total, and around 3/4 of this is in financial institutions. So again, big disparities, but that tends to be because we have more corporates that are on the radar of international investors, such as financial institutions, that tend to get rated more by the 3 major ratings agencies. And finally, moving to pillar 5, which is looking at sustainable investments. So we are seeing this on a global level, that there is this trend, this urgency, this awareness that non-financial sources of risk can become very systemic. The pandemic is a good example of that, or a bad example, however you want to call it, that financial systems, economic systems are vulnerable to things that have nothing to do with the economy at first sight, the pandemic being one, and of course climate change is the big challenge for the future. So there is a very big drive to build back better, to ensure that the recovery is a sustainable one, and that economies are resilient to the climate emergency. The region, if we move to the next slide, is particularly vulnerable to such shocks. And that means that there is also important opportunities for investment in renewable energy, for example. And that's something where we've already seen the most progress. So in 4 out of 8 countries, so half the countries in the region, 75% or more of the energy is generated from renewable sources. That's something that a lot of regions around the world would find quite an enviable characteristic. In the case of Costa Rica, it's almost 100%. So it's already there, but there's still a lot more to be done and a lot of investment opportunities in terms of getting the share even higher for some of these countries. If we move to the next slide, that's looking at the infrastructure side. So there's also acceleration in terms of the deployment of green transport projects. So there is an electric train planned for Costa Rica, for example, as you can see in this image. Electric buses are already running in Costa Rica and Guatemala. And there is more projects like that that can be planned for different countries in the region. If we move to the next slide, that's looking also at sustainable investments in terms of the capital market side. So it's not just about, for investors, many of them are not able to invest directly in real estate and infrastructure projects. For example, a lot of central bank reserves managers that we talk to, or sovereign funds, pension fund investments that need more liquid asset classes to invest in. Green bonds can be a good example or a good asset class for them to be able to invest in. The supply is still very small, but we have had already 5 green bonds that have been issued in the Central American region, and these are used, and these are special instruments to fund climate-related activities. So CABE has also issued one, and perhaps we can hear more about this in the panel discussion later. And then a final, if we move to the next slide, just to show you also an example in the report, we also have these pages my colleagues have worked on country focus for different countries. So there you get a specific outline of what the country has been doing, the macroeconomic indicators, the trade indicators, what are some of the highlights, both in terms of the investment opportunities, the landscape, what are the challenges and the prospects for each country. So I really encourage you to download the report. This was a very short introduction to what my colleagues have worked on, and there's a lot of work has gone into this. But please download, and we're very excited to also hear from you if you have comments, questions on the contents of the report. My colleagues and I would be very happy to talk to you about that. So building on this, I'd now like to invite our panelists to join me for the discussion of this report. So I'm very pleased that we have, of course, Dan Timossi, Executive President of the Central Bank for Economic Integration, joining us. We also have Baroness Gloria Hooper, who is also the Prime Minister's Trade Envoy to Costa Rica, the Dominican Republic, and Panama, joining us from London. And we also have Dong Jun Kim, Executive Director representing the Republic of Korea, in the Central American Bank for Economic Integration. Thank you very much to all of you, and welcome to this report launch and discussion. So let me start with you, President Mossi. So I've just presented what the report findings have been, and it'd be great to hear from you your perspective in terms of the integration project. You've seen it kind of firsthand. How do you see it's going so far? What are the priorities for you going forward in terms of integration in Central America? Thank you.
Thank you very much. First of all, I think this is a report that is being prepared by someone outside the region, which gives more credibility to whatever I might say. But yet, let me start by saying that I was asked to join a meeting with all the presidents of Central America on March 12th. And then I realized how the presidents were looking at this crisis as a very serious and significant event. And I must confess, I was not prepared to what I heard in terms of shutting down borders, shutting down air travel. But yet, I also heard very positive things, such as even though we're closing to passengers, we will have the borders open for trade. So I think that was a significant event in terms of how things have changed. Basically, after the economy shut down for what everyone expected to be at most 2 months, now it's almost 6 months, and some economies, most economies have opened, but in some way or other, the dip in the economic activity was significant. And yet, what kept the economies on, going was actually regional trade. There's something very particular to this block, and is that it's very similar to Asia in a way. The most significant trading partner for Central America is the U.S., but the second trading partner is Central America. So this decision of not shutting down borders for trade and investment of the region was actually a lifesaver for all the economic activity during this pandemic. So, one other fact that I think is important you highlighted, and I think is significant, and this is actually, to be very honest with you, the first time I heard it was in Korea, when the Minister of Finance told me, oh, that Central America is the fourth largest economy in Latin America. The fourth. So it's after Mexico, Argentina, Brazil, and Colombia. So this is significant because if you look at the countries as individual clients, they are very small. But when you look at the block, it makes sense to actually have this trading block. So on top of that, I had a meeting with the IMF, and one of the striking facts when they were asked, which of the countries do you think is going to be better at the surviving this crisis? And they said the countries that have the better macro. And so it wasn't the best hospitals, it was who had the capacity to borrow and sustain the crisis. So in that sense, Central America, as you highlighted, had a very sensible macro. I mean, some better than others, but in general, the indicators were in the right direction. The other, I think very important fact is that Central America is a very open region to trade and investment. And so we have these trade agreements, the most recent with the UK. And, we actually signed that treaty. And just a couple of months, and now we are dealing with a special trading line from UKEP in dealing with investments in health in the poorest of all the countries, Nicaragua. So trade and investment go hand in hand. And so I'm glad this region is open to investment even during the crisis. So this is wonderful news for the region that in the middle of the crisis, we are hearing from partners like the UK, Korea, Taiwan, Spain that still bet on Central America. So there's still a lot of room with energy, logistics, and probably not on all public investment, but on the PPP agenda. And I once again look up to the UK that basically invented the word PPP. So I'm really looking forward for that. And lastly, I mean, during the crisis, and this is one I think fantastic uh, fact for Cave. Cave, increases capital from $5 billion to $7 billion, 40% increase during the pandemic. So this is quite an achievement. I mean, I just spoke with the president of the IDB, and he intends to. He told me to repeat the miracle of Cave. I mean, we actually increased our capital during the crisis, and not every I mean, all capital is not the same. We have fantastic partners in Korea and Taiwan. Based they are very solid economies and have proven that during the pandemic is there's a way out. So there's the right way of getting out of the crisis. I mean, they have not had this uh, terrible second wave that we have seen in Europe. I mean, there are second waves, but when you look at the figures, it's not that bad. So um, I'm not trying to be the optimistic of the group, but I am though, and I think this region is really set up for a rapid growth because this disaster is not about what we produce is not being produced right. It's just that markets are shut down in different parts of the world, but yet our second most important market is still open and open for business. So I'm very optimistic. I really thank you for the report. I think it's gonna show the region through more independent eyes than ours. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, President Mossi. It's great to hear also your insights from having spoken to a lot of partners from around the world, the IMF, the IDB, as you said, and also to get an insight into what the region has been doing. And perhaps we can return to more specific questions around the projects that you're working on in the latter part of the discussion. But let me turn now to Dongjun Kim, from the Executive Director representing the Republic of Korea in the Central American Bank for Economic Integration. And we heard about the links with Korea, so I think a lot of our audience would be curious to know what are the main reasons that drove South Korea to build such strong ties with Central America? What is it that makes Central America stand out for you from other blocs in the region, in Latin America and the Caribbean? What are the benefits that you think this region in particular has attracted such strong interest? Thank you.
Uh, uh, Thank you, Director Kyriakopoulos. Responding to the pandemic is demanding high level of public expenditure. This is in turn a threat to fiscal stability and could weaken government ability to address rising poverty and inequality. So according to World Bank, Central America's economy is projected to shrink by 3.6% this year, with huge government spending, lower government revenue due to the decrease in remittance, halt in tourism, and lower agricultural price relative to 2019. So although international finance institutions such as IMF, World Bank, IDB, and CABE approved significant amount of financial support, it is not good enough to fill the funding gap under COVID-19 pandemic. This is why we are talking about FDI today. So Central America has to make better effort to attract FDI, especially from extra-regional countries like Korea. Then the question is how. So as Director Kyriakopoulos and President Mossi mentioned earlier, the region has three advantages that other regions do not have. Those are first, large and growing working age population, second, regional economic integration, and third, nearshoring. So Central America must make good use of those advantages to attract FDI. It is not an advice, but must be done to advance the growth of the region. Especially integrated Central America can more efficiently allocate economic resources and investment, access new intra-regional market, boost foreign trade, improve commercial agreement, enter new ones with increased bargaining power, increase market diversification, attract FDI, and build supply chain resilience. Korea can be a good example. Due to those advantages of Central America, in February 2018, the Korean government officially signed FTA agreement with 5 Central American countries: Costa Rica, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Honduras, and Panama. And tariff on more than 95% of all items were eliminated immediately or gradually. This FTA is significant for 2 reasons. First, it has been achieved under the strengthened global protectionism. Second, Korea was the first country in Asia to have FTA with Central America. Korea also joined CABE last year following FTA agreement. It was because CABE's investment in the region account for over 50% of total investment made by MDBs, and CABE has higher expertise and wider network in the region than any other MDBs. So Korea believed that we could maximize synergy effect by collaborating with CABE in addition to FTA agreement. This year, Korea is setting a successful partnership with CABE through multiple channels. For example, for the first time, the Korean government will lend sovereign ODA loan to CABE to support the region in coping with COVID-19. Korean government also installed $50 million of trust fund in last May. Thanks to the effort of President Morsi, CABE will open a regional office in Korea next year. This office will serve as a tool for expanding cooperation between two sides and promoting investment from Korea in Central America. As such, CABE is not only a valuable asset for the region, but also an attraction for extra-regional countries to invest in Central America. We often witnessed developed countries taking advantage of crisis. So COVID-19 could be the chance for the region to reshape as an attractive place of investment. I'm sure that there are many countries like Korea to invest in Central America. To bring them into region, Central America must be integrated better, business-friendly, transparent, improve the rule of law, and most importantly, making good use of CABE as a channel for FDI. So let me close my remark with 2 old sayings for the region. 2 heads are better than 1, and together we live, dispersed we die. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Great to get an insight on that, and it sounds like that's an exciting road ahead also with the regional office. Let me turn now to Baroness Hooper. It sounds like there's quite a lot of competition for engagement with Central America, but what do you see the UK's role in this? Because the UK is also in a phase where it's looking for external trading partners, is putting a lot of emphasis on this. There is a lot of government energy going into connecting with regions beyond its immediate neighborhood. So can you talk us through the existing trading relationships between the UK and Central America, and also what do you see the outlook for that in the future?
Thank you. And may I say buenos dias and buenas tardes as appropriate. It's a great pleasure to be participating in this conference and in the launch of the excellent OMFIF CABE report. As a newly appointed, I hasten to say, trade envoy to Costa Rica, Dominican Republic, and Panama, it is very useful to be exposed to all the information in the report and in the presentations today. which clearly illustrate the many opportunities for collaboration and coordination and an exciting, if challenging, way forward for the United Kingdom in Central America. It may, however, be helpful if I start by outlining my role and expectations as a trade envoy. In the light of Brexit, and now with the added impetus of rebuilding better after COVID-19, a number of people, mostly members of Parliament, have been appointed by the Prime Minister as trade envoys to key markets, which are the focus for the Department for International Trade and the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office's best efforts. The idea is that we supplement and add a new dimension to the government's existing trade commissioners in various regions and to the day-to-day essential work of our ambassadors and their teams, as well as engaging with the private sector wherever possible. And I'm only sorry that Luis Cardenal has not been here as a contributor from the private sector today. In my own case, we see unique opportunities for UK companies, especially small and medium-sized enterprises. In each market, there's scope to increase our market share of exports and investments. Panama is a regional hub for banking and finance, as well as for UK exports in the wider Latin American region. Costa Rica is the region's most ambitious country for climate change, as we've heard from the report, and has a reputation for stable economic growth. The Dominican Republic I have down as the regional leader for attracting direct investment, but I recognize that from the report, it comes second after Panama for direct investment. However, all three of, as it were, my countries figure in the first three of the leading countries for foreign direct investment. I see major opportunities for my own three top priorities. That's education with EdTech and language training and so on, energy, clean energy, electric vehicles, renewables, health, research cooperation, and indeed, as Dante Mossi has mentioned, hospital building projects such as we are now seeing in Nicaragua. Add to that the green investment and the lead up to COP26, which is due to take place in the UK next year. And we have a lot going on. And of course, there is huge potential for tourism post-COVID. And I note that Panama has already reopened its borders with regulation, and that Costa Rica plans to fully reopen its borders on the 1st of November. And I hope to be able to expand on these opportunities later on in our question and answer session. Interestingly, and in view of our colleague from South Korea being with us, I've seen a comparison made recently between Southeast Asia and Central America. While not as large or as crowded as Southeast Asia, Central America shares many of the same characteristics. Plenty of countries packed into a small region with young and expanding populations and creaking infrastructures which need attention. So it's hardly surprising that the first super app in the Americas should surface in Central America, but more of that anon. As Dante Mossi has said, the report is a tool for anyone who's interested in doing business in Central America. We want to do business, and I welcome the report. And maybe I may come back to your request in the ongoing session to establish the UK's existing trading relations. But of course, President Mossi has already referred to the UK continuity agreement, replacing our arrangements which existed under as members of the European Union. We have, I suppose, the most recognizable products from Central America that we see in our markets are delicious bananas, pineapples, avocados, and of course, the ever famous coffee. But there are other ways in which I hope we can improve greatly on our trading relationship. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Baroness Hooper. At this stage, let me remind also our audience that you can send through your questions. We're moving into the Q&A session now, but perhaps I can kick it off before we start collecting questions from the audience. It'd be great now we've had kind of an overview of the trading relationships, the investment relationships between Korea, the UK, Central America, and also the broader outlook for the region. Maybe we can talk more specifically about some of the projects that are going on. President Mossi, it'd be great to hear from you. What do you think are some of the sectors that are most promising, where there's already some development projects? We've heard just now about some of the agricultural trade, but also we spoke before about the sustainable investment and infrastructure projects. Can you give us just a sneak peek into what's going on right now? How is the recovery kind of centering on specific sectors? Thank you.
All right, no, thank you. You show a slide of as I would say, it's the first transformational project of Central America, which is the electric passenger train in San Jose, Costa Rica. We are just awaiting for the approval from their parliament, Congress, of the sovereign loan. And that's an opportunity of for the private sector to join in with $1 billion next to the $550 million from CABE. So I think this is a wonderful opportunity to make a difference. So, you know, rail culture comes from Britain. So I really hope that we can get some of that ingenuity from the UK. And more than that, there are very significant other projects. For example, we conducted a strategy on the gas, introduction of natural gas to Central America. We are looking at new technologies on how to bring compressed gas to the region. I'll go to a demo of this new technology in northern Honduras in about 2 weeks. And so we hope to actually to close a deal with a gas company to bring gas from the US to Honduras in the short term. But we're looking for more than that. I mean, the strategy for Central America requires the introduction of natural gas for heating and for electricity generation. But also, I mean, the Baroness mentioned kindly coffee. You know, Central America actually produces lots of coffee, but when we produce coffee, we sell it as a global commodity. So we are setting up a fund in Panama to sell a specialty coffee. I mean, coffees that are grown in the highlands by mostly, handpicked by women, most of them indigenous peoples. So this is very responsible grown coffee that could be sold to the world in one market, which will be in Panama, which is, as the Baroness mentioned, the one big gateway of the region. So it's going to be easier to sell specialty coffees at a differentiated price to the rest of the world. So this initiative is called Itre Café, and we expect to launch it by the end of the year. There are several, these are regional projects that I think are important, but also we are working with Korea in setting ports in the Caribbean of Central America. There are humongous opportunities between Central America and the Caribbean. We are close. We speak the same language, as I always say about the Dominican Republic. But the real trade in chips between Central America and the Caribbean is relatively poor. So we need to improve on that. And key component to that is to have good ports. Let me tell you another pet project that I have that I really like because it's very transformational. It's a ferry between Costa Rica and El Salvador. It's going to go in the Pacific Ocean, of course, and it's a relatively small investment, private, about $45 million. And the idea is to shorten the route between El Salvador and Costa Rica, so to introduce some competition to the local logistics. And but that shows that we still have room to go to improve the cost of doing business in the region. And the local private sector is actually very eager to invest and to try new technologies. I mean, ferries are relatively new to the area. Very few countries have them. So there's a lot to do, and we are very excited to use our recently approved strategy, which is just from CAVE own funds. It's about $15 billion for the next 5 years. So there are good quality projects in which companies can come from all CAVE member countries and also guest governments as well. I mean, they can come and enjoy of these investments that are backed by us. So I'm very optimistic about these projects coming forward.
Great, thank you. It's great to have some such concrete examples of the projects that are happening. It'd be great to hear also from your perspective, Dongjun Kim, what projects you see South Korea getting more involved in the region. Is it mostly infrastructure projects that there is greater interest in? What type of sectors do you think hold the kind of biggest potential for the region? We heard from President Mossi some of the projects you're involved in, but what do you see South Korea's role in the development of infrastructure projects and other projects in the region?
Thank you, Director Kyriakopoulos. According to your question, first, well, actually, the Central America has heavily invested in building infrastructure in the region, and it has contributed greatly to reduce poverty and economic development in the region. Nevertheless, the Central America is still facing infrastructure shortage, and they still need significant investment in infrastructure sector. So especially the establishment of transportation and communication infrastructure is very important for the region because it can serve as a foundation for balanced and inclusive growth by expanding inter-regional exchange and increasing access to economic opportunities for underdeveloped area and classes. And as you may know, Korea has achieved the fastest economic growth in the world based on the construction of infrastructure, development of a heavy industry and high-tech sectors from the ashes of the Korean War. So Korea is the only country that has experienced from the poorest country to the world top 10 advanced economy in just half century. So this experience and know-how will be very good example for Central American countries, and Korea is willing to share this experience and know-how with Central America. And another thing is that ICT is becoming more important under COVID pandemic, such as telework, teleconference, teleeducation, telemedicine, and on-tech marketing. So as you know, Korea is a global leading country in ICT sector, and Central America has more than 40 million internet users with similar language and cultural background, attracting attention as an emerging market with great growth potential in ICT sector. So if Korea's ICT competitiveness is combined with the growth potential of Central America, COVID pandemic will be an opportunity for innovation and growth that will upgrade both regional economies to the next level. And finally, I want to emphasize one more thing. Above all, human capital and education has to be the base for the development. This was the case for Korea. Korea didn't have any natural resources, but had only human capital. Highly educated and trained human capital was the only way out extreme poverty, and it was indeed a correct answer. So Korea is the best partner to share its experience in human capital and education with Central America. In this regard, I'm very glad that CABE approved 200 million US dollar for My New School program in El Salvador during the board of director meeting yesterday. I believe it will be a very good initiative and example for the region. Thank you.
Great, thank you. No, and I'm very glad you raised also the technology aspect, because that was one of the questions we received from the audience. Someone was asking what are the types of programs that are being pursued to diversify the economy of these countries towards more technology intensive economies. So just raising that so you're aware that that's something our listeners are interested in, but it's good that you've answered that already. Maybe let's move to you now, Baroness, and we have about 10 minutes to go. There is another question about in terms of how foreign direct investment and investment more general can help also strengthen democracy, transparency, and the rule of law in Central America. Is that something that you have some views on, perhaps?
Yes, thank you. Beyond trade, and obviously establishing trade is a priority, and particularly, if I may refer to other comments that have been made, the whole issue of green investment opportunities is very important to us, as we know it is in Latin America, and two key sectors for green investment and are green energy and sustainable transport. And there are, of course, the non-renewable, the traditional renewable energies of wind and solar, but energy efficiency investments in buildings could reduce carbon footprints, which while generating many low-skilled jobs during building retrofits, as we're seeing in the hospital sector, particularly in Nicaragua, which has been mentioned. But on the transport side, a renewed focus on public transport and an integration of electric vehicles is vital, and that is, I suppose, a social good in terms of enabling people to live in a clean, green environment. But in other areas, I think it's very useful.
Perhaps, sorry, to follow up on that, because it's great that you raised the sustainability aspects, and of course Central America is very vulnerable to this in terms of rising sea levels, natural disasters, and so on. But something that is becoming also very important in that debate is not just how we can have a green transition, but also a just transition, and how with the movement to new industries, those that are displaced in industries that were successful before, how can that transition mean that no one is left behind? And that's a question that we have also from the audience on this. So how do you think that transition can happen effectively from fossil fuels to renewables while ensuring it is also just?
Well, this is an issue for every country in the world, actually, but we do have some international development sustainable initiatives, and we have particular funds. The Green Climate Fund, which supports programs to preserve natural habitats more in the biodiversity field. The Darwin Initiative and the Clean Technology Fund, which is probably the most interesting for these purposes, which finances large-scale technologies like solar power. And this is an area where I hope that we will be able to develop further links and projects. I mean, it has to be done on an incremental basis. I mean, nobody can wave a magic wand and transform everything overnight. So it has to be a step-by-step approach. And this is where education is important, because in the whole field of education, helping people to behave responsibly themselves can lead to better things. But I would also like to emphasize that in terms of going beyond the actual facts and figures and trade, this educational side is important, as I've said, but there are also huge cultural links. And in order to overcome the perceived barriers of perhaps language, the perception of violence, corruption, and human rights issues, which Dongjun Kim also referred to, as well as the rule of law, and indeed the natural disasters, which you have mentioned. It's absolutely essential to emphasize all the positive things of the cultural links. For example, the United Kingdom, especially on the Caribbean side of these countries, has a lot of cultural links. I mean, they even play cricket in some countries. And of course, Belize comes within your CABE's integration program and your report. We need more opportunities to get the message across, and we can only do this by having successful projects on which we can build.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you to you all and also to our audience. There's been some questions that we've not been able to address, but it's great that you've been referencing also education, because we also had some questions around this, around inequalities, maybe something for you, President Mossi, to ponder on. We won't have time to answer everything on this panel, but we've had questions around how can we reduce the inequalities in terms of the FDI levels that different countries within the region receive. So I know a lot of the emphasis is on presenting the region as a bloc, but there is still different disparities in terms of the level of FDI that they receive. How can we make that more inclusive was one question. Also in terms of the role of CABE in supporting the economies in the recovery, because yes, we saw that it's more resilient than other groups, but there is still going to be a big shock to the economy, to unemployment levels. How are you actively supporting a lot of these sectors that are hit? And also in terms of how we can boost the services industry as well, because we've talked a lot about infrastructure projects, manufacturing and agriculture, but also how can new business contacts be made for the services industry to make better education and development in the region and improving education quality among the different local economies. So these are just some of the themes that have come up. Thank you to all of our audience for presenting these views. I'll now hand back to you, Dante Mossi, for some closing remarks. And thank you very much from me for the panel to all of you.
No, thank you very much for all the comments. We at CABE, we are very proud that this type of event gets us very closer in terms of learning more about each other. One last thing that I want to leave the flavor is that something we have learned, particularly from our Asian countries, is that we need to learn with this new reality of COVID-19. So let me just tell you two things that we are doing different and new from what we had taught earlier. One, we are actually using our facilities with the financial sector to introduce hybrid and electric vehicles in a way to be more sustainable in the transport sector, which is sometimes one sector that we overlook. So I think this is very important, and we're working very hard with all the manufacturers of the region to make sure that there's availability of this type of vehicle and motorcycles. I mean, because that's a very used vehicle. And number two, I mean, thanks to the generosity of Korea, but learning from their ingenuity as well, we are beating out the feasibility study of manufacturing plan for biomedical equipment in Central America. So we will set all the countries to compete for the decision where to put this facility to bring, as my director mentioned, the nearshoring of even medical supplies to the region. I mean, it's something we learned during this pandemic is that, during emergencies, you better have the capabilities to actually face this type of crisis, which is not going to be the last, regretfully. So we're very optimistic. We have fantastic friends throughout the world, some older than the others in terms of for how long we know each other. We have trade agreements with UK, with Korea, which are so far from Central America, yet they are so close to us in this way forward. So Thank you very much for everyone for attending, and please do read the report once it's available. Thank you.